Welcome, everyone. My name is Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined and that you're joining us today for this event on the war on Lebanon. I want to extend a special thank you to the Middle East Report and Information Project, or MERIP, for being our co-sponsor. If you don't already know, MERIP is an independent nonprofit organization that has supported the publication of critical reporting and analysis of politics, culture, and society in the Middle East since 1971. Their publications are reader-supported, and all of their analysis is available now without a paywall. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by the authors of the recent MERIP primer on Lebanon to discuss the deep history and context of Lebanon in order to shed light on the expansion of war from Gaza to Lebanon following Israel's pager attacks, bombings, assassination of Hezbollah leadership, and now a ground invasion. So this event is a joint event between the Institute for Middle East Studies and MERIP. And so we're delighted that it can be moderated by MERIP editorial board member Laleh Khalili, who's professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter. I'd also like to just take a minute to introduce our speakers. So Nadya Sbaiti teaches at the Department of History at Georgetown University, Qatar. She specializes in the social and cultural histories of the modern Middle East and is most recently the co-editor of the volume Practicing Sectarianism, Archival and Ethnographic Interventions on Lebanon, published by Stanford University Press in 2022, with two of the other presenters as co-authors, Lara Deeb and Tsolin Nalbantian. Tsolin Nalbantian teaches modern Middle East history at Leiden University in the Netherlands, along with the aforementioned book. She's also author of Armenians Beyond Diaspora, Making Lebanon Their Own, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. And she co-edited The Armenian Diaspora and Stateless Power, Collective Identity in the Transnational 20th Century with IB Tauris Bloomsbury as publisher last year. Next, we have Maya Mikdashi, who teaches gender and women's studies and is the chair of Middle East Studies at Rutgers University. She is the author most recently of Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, published by Stanford University Press in 2022. She's also a co-founding editor, along with Nadya, of Jedaleya, the journal. Lara Deeb is our last speaker. She teaches anthropology and Middle East studies at Scripps College in California, and she is the author and co-author or editor of 5 books, including most recently Love Across Difference, Mixed Marriage in Lebanon, published by Stanford University Press in 2024. Her first book, An Enchanted Modern, Gender and Public Piety in Shia Lebanon, published by Princeton University Press in 2006, is, in my opinion, one of the most important books written about both gender in Lebanon and about Shia Lebanon, and I actually still teach it till this day. I also just want to thank Jim Ryan from MERIP for coordinating this, and the moderator and speakers for joining us at relatively last minute event. And I also want to thank the IMIS Assistance Program Director, Christian Clinton, for setting up the call and that enabled all of us to be here today. I will now hand the floor over to Laleh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mona, for the introduction. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I am also incredibly grateful to Christian for being such an incredible organizer of the events. This is an incredibly important moment and an incredibly important event because I think some of the depredations that Israel is inflicting on the region at the moment really do need to be analyzed in ways that I believe are not covered in the mainstream press in either the United States, the United Kingdom, or the countries in Europe where some of us are based. I also want to acknowledge and mark the passing of Joe Stork, who was the founder of one of the founding members of the Middle East report some I don't know, however many years ago in the 1970s, and it's and he actually, as he and his comrades established Merip at a moment that there was quite actually a lot of fascinating, really exciting groups emerging in Washington D.C. For example, Arab activist groups, and out of that moment of ferment, a number of different institutions have emerged, which have been quite crucial in ensuring that the voices of people from the Middle East are heard over the din of imperial interests in Washington, D.C. Okay, on that note, a quick discussion, a quick brief about what we're going to be doing from this point forward. Essentially, what is going to happen is going to be that each of our speakers are going to speak for a brief moment, about 5 or 6 minutes, about one aspect of their area of expertise, which was also covered in the primer. Then we're going to have about 30 minutes of conversations and Q&A between myself and the panelists, and then we're going to have a 30-minute moderated audience Q&A. I would encourage you, if you have any questions, to look for the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please enter any questions you might have there. I don't think that the audience will have access to chat there. The order of events is going to be Nadya Sbaiti is going to talk about Ottoman history through to the Mandate and Palestine. Tsolin Nalbantian is going to speak to the long history of US involvement in Lebanon and the Lebanese elite's role in that. Lara Deeb is going to be speaking about the Israeli attacks on Lebanon and Hezbollah specifically, and of course the life of the Shia folks in Lebanon, since that's an area of her expertise. And finally, Mikdashi is going to speak about the many crises before October 2023 and how they have shaped the current moment. So on that note, I cede the floor to Nadya. And Nadya, please take the podium, take the virtual podium.
The virtual podium. Thank you so much, Laleh. And I also want to just add our thanks to Jim Ryan and to Merip and to Manati and IMS for hosting us so quickly about this. I want to start just by acknowledging that we are all in a state of kind of constant grief. It's grief for the number of people who have been killed by Israeli bombings in Lebanon. I believe as of this morning, it's more than 2,500 people killed and over 12,000 who have been injured. It's also grief for the destruction of the places that we love and the violence that have been done to the memories that we have of these places. And I also want to, in addition to the vicious ending of human life, I also want to register that late summer and fall, so right now, is prime olive harvesting season, right? In Lebanon as well as in Palestine. And in South Lebanon, Israeli bombing has destroyed over 60,000 olive trees. And I believe in Gaza, it's more than 75% of the olive trees that have been destroyed. So that's my lead up to the history, because we are going to talk about how these two places are connected. So in the Ottoman period, there was no Lebanon during the Ottoman period. What often gets discussed by pundits and some scholars as quote unquote Ottoman Lebanon largely refers to Mount Lebanon, which became the geographical ideological locus of the post-World War I mandatory state. However, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the cities and towns that would later constitute Lebanon were part of the same Ottoman administrative districts that also included cities and towns of the future mandates of Palestine and Syria as well. So during the Ottoman reform era of the 19th century, the Vilayet of Syria, or Vilayet al-Sham, came to include the area from Aleppo south to Aqaba and from the Mediterranean east to the Syrian desert, with the exception of Mount Lebanon, which was governed as a semi-autonomous province or mutasarrifiyya after 1861. During this period, the Ottoman state then separated Jerusalem, Jaffa, Hebron, and Gaza from the Vilayet al-Sham and governed this area directly, leaving Nablus, Akka, Haifa, and the Galilee in the Vilayet al-Sham. And southern Lebanon in the post-war period were already deeply enmeshed with one another and would remain so into the first half of the 20th century. At the outbreak of World War I, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. A combination of Ottoman food requisitioning, an Allied naval blockade, and local war profiteering triggered a devastating famine in Ottoman Syria that led to the death of 1 in 6 civilians and carried repercussions for Lebanon's post-war boundaries. Following the First World War, the Allied victory meant that the dismantling of what remained of the Ottoman Empire was done in such a way that the League of Nations mandates divided the former Ottoman Arab provinces between France and Great Britain, where France received the mandates over Syria, and of course from there Greater Lebanon, and Great Britain received the mandates over Iraq and Palestine, which was then split into Palestine and Transjordan. In 1920, France carves Greater Lebanon out of Syria, combining Mount Lebanon with Tripoli, Beirut, Saida, Sur, Akkad, and the Bekaa Valley. The Zionist movement at that point, well underway in Palestine, unsuccessfully lobbied Great Britain and France to include the Litani River, now in South Lebanon, into the mandate for Palestine. Many in these new mandates deemed the borders illegitimate. Not only were they imposed by Western powers that were recognized as imperialist, they also severed long-standing social, economic, and religio-political networks that traversed these now divided territories. Over the next 2 decades, mandate authorities and local elites cultivated sectarian differences, enmeshing them into Lebanon's daily life, its political, economic, bureaucratic, and social institutions. Lebanon would eventually recognize 18 sects. And many of the various ways that sect shapes Lebanese life have grown out of this institutionalization. For example, Lebanon's political sectarian government system was partly imagined in the National Pact, a 1943 tacit agreement between Maronite and Sunni leaders meant to maintain sectarian political balance. Despite never being formalized, by custom, the prime minister has always been Sunni, the president Maronite, the speaker of parliament Shiite. Moreover, nearly every position, from member of parliament to mayor to public university professor, has been distributed by sect. Central to the sectarian distribution of power are Lebanon's 15 personal status laws, corresponding to 15 of the 18 sects, and their role in census registries and bureaucracy. Shia Muslims were underrepresented in this political sectarian system, in part due to the flawed nature of the 1932 census on which this initial distribution was based. Over time, the unequal distribution of power and resources became more pronounced as the system failed to take into consideration demographic changes. As sect became a means to channel state resources into communities, rural Shiite areas experienced disproportionate poverty, a problem aggravated by feudal land-owning elites. Despite the imposition of these new political post-war borders, people continued to move through them as they fought to maintain their pre-war networks, albeit with increasing difficulty. So merchants in Beirut would continue to trade with Haifa. Pilgrims of various religious denominations crossed borders to visit religious shrines. The territorial and topographical contiguity between northern Palestine and southern Lebanon remains a visual reminder of just how closely their fates have been tied. Verdant yet rocky terrain, olive groves, and important waterways connected these spaces, as did peasants who worked tracts of agricultural land from Nablus to Sur. Historically, Jabal Amel was an area that comprised what is now southern Lebanon all the way to the Upper Galilee in Palestine. They used to be called, in fact, 2 lungs of the same body. Jabal Amel was a key region for socioeconomic and cultural life, with goods, people, and ideas traversing northern Palestine to modern-day Syria. The Ottoman and Mamluk souks in the Ameli town of Nabatiya, which were recently destroyed by Israeli bombing, as well as the souks of Bint Jbeil, were important economic and social nodes connecting these areas to Haifa, not to Beirut. Many Ameli families had relatives in what became Palestine and Syria. Bint Jbeil tobacco merchants sold their goods in Palestinian cities, and the Palestinian pound was a far more common sight in South Lebanon than the Lebanese one. Southern Lebanon and northern Palestine also have had intertwined anti-colonial trajectories. The 1936 Palestine revolt had a more immediate and profound impact on southern Lebanon than did the Syrian revolt a decade earlier. Bint Jbeil became a center for multiple anti-colonial resistance movements, including its own against the French mandate. And Palestinians who became involved in the 1936 revolt purchased their arms in southern Lebanon. During the 1948 Nakba, which brought over 100,000 Palestinian refugees to Lebanon, residents of South Lebanon witnessed firsthand the violence visited upon the Palestinians by Zionist militias. Zionist designs on the waters of the Litani River brought that violence north of the mandate border on at least one occasion. And the ripple effects of the Nakba's massive population displacements has had profound effects on Lebanon's subsequent decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadya, and for reminding us the extent to which Palestine and Lebanon's fates, peoples, and lands have been intimately connected. Tsolin, I want to invite you to speak next about the long history of the U.S. involvement in Lebanon, in particular, picking up on the way that this has intensified in the last year or so. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you also to the organizers, Merab and the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. And I want to thank also Laleh for moderating. It's really special to do this with you and also with my co-writers. I don't know what I would be doing without you actually these days. So thank you. So I want to just focus a few minutes today on the history of US and Israeli involvement in Lebanon. And if there's one sort of word that I want to keep in mind while I'm speaking is the word repetition. From what I see, so much of what happens today, are repetitions of prior follies, miscalculations, and crimes of both the US and Israel. And while both the US and Israel often work in tandem, I'm going to separate the two a bit, as I believe this is useful in understanding their different interests, at least historically. And I say this also to distinguish what we are witnessing today. So not just US complicity in Israeli crimes against humanity, but rather this is US policy. So I think many identify 1958 as really being the starting point for US military involvement in Lebanon. And I think it's actually a little bit more helpful if we go back further in time to the end of World War II, so that we see US decisions outside of the traditional Cold War binary. So the Cold War certainly plays a role, but reading it only in that way sort of deflects from what I think are the greater US concerns actually at that time, namely these past memories of the Great Depression and pressures to find markets and resources and the overall growth of US empire. So while Lebanon, has no oil, it was a state that provides access. So access to the Tapline oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia to Saida in Lebanon, construction of military bases, access to air transit rights, commercial expansion, and corporate enterprise. So the Cold War at times offers a reason for interventionism, but it really plays a backseat to this US state policy of guaranteeing itself access. And this type of intervention, should also be placed in conversation with other types of US military involvement that's happening at the same time. So I'm thinking Iran in 1951, Guatemala in 54, and the Congo Zaire in 1959. For the US, what was likewise super helpful was that in Lebanon, members of the Lebanese ruling class, which comprised primarily of Sunni and Maronite landowners and merchants, paved the way for US companies and US involvement. They were also part of the coherent elite. So there was an incentive for the US to support and maintain this ruling class. And this ruling class was not about allocating resources, right? So for example, customs duties that are a source of wealth didn't go to much needed social services, right? It went back to this elite. And while the US and the Lebanese ruling classes, these interests often align, they are not always the same. So this is similar to the situation that I started off with when I was talking about the US and Israel. So just like we have to go back to understand US military involvement in Lebanon, we have to do the same with Israel. So the political department of the Jewish Agency maintained contact with different communities in Lebanon, but primarily the Maronite community since the 1930s, right? And David Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary supporting a Christian state in Lebanon whose border ended at the Litani River. By 1950, Israel begins to offer financial support to the Phalange Party, which is one of the main parties of the Maronite community. So these are small, right, in comparison to what happens later, right? These are small maneuvers, but they're in ways no less consequential, especially as they demonstrate an ongoing and repeated effort to establish Israeli hegemony and a greater Israel that certainly annexes the West Bank. So redrawing Lebanon's boundaries was intrinsic to these goals and historically has never been defensive in nature. And so I can go on, and I won't, but I can go on to give sort of certain examples, like just really briefly, like Ben Gurion saying, like, we have to bring a Christian state into our neighborhood. These are all examples of involvement. Or that we have to intervene in Lebanon and create a Christian state and help Israel out of isolation. This was also supported by people like Moshe Dayan. Or Menachem Begin, who believed that this was a moral duty, right, to protect Maronite Christians. And at the time, Defense Minister Sharon, who really felt that Christians were an instrument, actually, for Israeli hegemony. These are all constant examples and repetitions that I can go on. So the details may change, right, but the involvement is maintained. But what I want to end with, just very quickly, is just in conclusion, is that it's really important to note that military superiority does not equal political achievements, and that also repeats over and over again. So I think I'll end there and give it back to you, Laleh, and thank you.
Thank you, Tsolin, and especially for mentioning the Litani River, which is actually in the news all the time, because as some of the fascists in the furthest right of the fascist government in Israel are beginning to sort of imagine settling around the Litani River. It's always been a desiderata of the Israeli state from the Yishuv times until now. Thank you so much for that, and I'm going to now pass the mic to Lara to talk a little bit about Israeli attacks on Lebanon and, of course, on Hezbollah and the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the role of Hezbollah.
Okay, I'm gonna again add my thanks. It's already been expressed so eloquently by Nadya and Tsolin to everybody involved in pulling this event together, which of course joins the ever-growing list of events that we all wish were unnecessary. So I'm gonna talk about two related points that I'll show through a condensed timeline of Israeli attacks on Lebanon, and then I'll say just a few words about the Dahya doctrine at the end. So the first point is that just as the genocide in Gaza, during which at this point the Israeli military has killed at least 42,000 Palestinians and likely hundreds of thousands, just as that did not begin last October, Israeli violence against Lebanon did not begin last October, nor did Israeli violence against civilians in either place begin with the founding of Hezbollah in 1984 or the founding of Hamas in 1987, right? It all begins with the Israeli state's inception. And the second point is that, again, just as we are seeing in Gaza, the Israeli state consistently describes their attacks as precision strikes directed at specific groups while actually targeting civilians. And again, it has done that for decades. So during the Nakba, and Nadya mentioned this briefly, in October 1948, which is just 5 months after Israel unilaterally declared its existence, Israeli armed forces crossed into Lebanon and occupied 14 Lebanese villages in the south, a part of South Lebanon that again includes the Litani River's water, so that comes back again, and is part of those greater Israel designs. And then during armistice negotiations, the border returned to the original line, but during that period, a unit of the Israeli army massacred all the civilians remaining in the Lebanese village of Huda, which were some 50 civilians who hadn't already fled. They literally locked them in a building and blew it up on top of them. And I provide that detail also to show that the kinds of tactics and brutality that we are seeing in the current genocide also go back to the Israeli state's inception, right? Then during the Lebanese Civil War, which began in 1975, Israeli troops invaded Lebanon twice. In 1978, they invaded the south. And here's where my second point comes in about the dissonance between the stated Israeli goal and the actual targets of violence. They claimed their goal was to remove the PLO, stop PLO from sending rockets into Israel from South Lebanon. Yet over the 2 weeks of that invasion, Israeli troops killed nearly 2,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, mostly civilians, and displaced 250,000 people. In 1982, Israeli troops invaded again, went all the way to Beirut and put West Beirut under a really devastating siege. So they cut off civilians' access to water, electricity, and food for 3 months that summer and regularly bombed Beirut. Again, stated intention, the removal of the PLO, or the targeted assassination of a PLO leader, or the destruction of PLO infrastructure. Again, that invasion and siege killed approximately 20,000 people, mainly civilians. And it was during that invasion that the Israeli army provided cover for the Lebanese forces, the right-wing Maronite militia allied with them, to massacre thousands of Palestinian and Shia Muslim civilian refugees in the Sabra and Shatila camps in Beirut. So Hezbollah was formed after these Israeli invasions. It comes into being to fight the Israeli occupiers, and it would not exist in this current form without those invasions and those repeated attacks on civilians in Lebanon. So then when the Israeli military withdrew from most of Lebanon in 1985, it continued to occupy about 10% of the south, both with Israeli troops and also by relying on a proxy Lebanese militia pretty heavily at times. And during that occupation, which lasted 22 years, the Israeli military attacked civilians and civilian infrastructure multiple times. So in 1993, over 100 were killed in Israeli attacks over 7 days. In 1996, 1999, and 2000, Israeli warplanes destroyed power plants in Lebanon. In 1996, also, the Israeli military had a campaign they called Grapes of Wrath. And during that military campaign, the airstrikes bombed a United Nations bunker in Ghana, where 800 civilians had taken refuge, killing 106 and injuring 116 Lebanese and 4 Fijian UNIFIL soldiers. And I, again, bring up these details because now this current round of violence is not the first time that the Israeli army is attacking United Nations personnel and sites. So the occupation ended in 2000 because the resistance led by Hezbollah had made it too costly for Israel. Then there's a period of relative calm. And then in 2006, the Israeli state launched a 33-day war on Lebanon on a scale that was unseen since the 1982 invasion. And yet again, the stated goals were to disarm and remove Hezbollah from South Lebanon. Again, what actually happened? Israeli airstrikes, this time with naval support and a ground invasion, killed over 1,000 Lebanese, mostly civilians, wounded thousands, and displaced 500,000 people. That Israeli attack also caused $3 billion of infrastructural damage in Lebanon, flattening entire villages in the south and whole neighborhoods in the southern suburb of Beirut. Many of those villages and neighborhoods are being flattened by Israeli bombardment again today. And they focused their airstrikes on civilian infrastructure, right? So not only things like runways and roads and bridges, but also sewage treatment facilities or wheat silos, a dairy, factories. And the Israeli general who was in charge of the Northern Command at the time, his name was Gadi Eisenkot, he actually named this level of destruction the Dahya Doctrine, after the southern suburb of Beirut, which is known as Dahya. Eisenkot explained that the Dahya Doctrine explicitly called for the use of massive, disproportionate force on civilian infrastructure. And he stated that the Israeli military categorically views civilian villages, buildings, and infrastructure as military bases. Now, it's obviously worth noting that 2006 was not the first time the Israeli military targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. The entire history of Israeli colonization in Palestine demonstrates that. But this is the first time that I know of that they named it as an explicit strategy. The Dahya Doctrine governed the 2006 war on Lebanon. It also governed the multiple devastating Israeli attacks on Gaza since 2008. And at first glance, it really seemed to be the doctrine governing the Israeli genocide on Palestinians in Gaza that we've been witnessing for the past year and the current Israeli war on Lebanon. But I say at first glance because, we don't have any new direct quotes from an Israeli general about a new doctrine like we do for the Dahya Doctrine, but there are several journalists and scholars, including Tuful Abu Hadeb, who have pointed out, and I think they're right, that since last October, the Israeli war plan that under the Dahya Doctrine kills civilians by targeting civilian infrastructure has expanded significantly, and it's now targeting civilians themselves, right? So it's not just the infrastructure, it's actually the people that are the targets. So now we have to talk about a Gaza Doctrine. Another way to think about this is that in 2006 in Lebanon, for the most part, people were able to stay alive by evacuating certain parts of the country. And that is not the case today, and it's certainly not the case in Gaza. So again, now we have this Gaza Doctrine that is explicitly targeting people, ranging from leaders like Nasrallah to indiscriminate targeting like the pager attacks in Lebanon, to hospitals in both Lebanon and Gaza, to refugee tents and designated alleged safe zones in Gaza, to this genocide within a genocide that's been happening in North Gaza over the past, I don't know how many days now. And then the last thing I want to say is just that this Gaza Doctrine was absolutely enabled by the impunity with which the Dahya Doctrine was allowed to destroy Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza multiple times since 2008, which I think begs the question of where the impunity with which Israel carries out a genocide today is going to lead us. So that's where I will stop for now.
want to say a couple of things off of what you've said. The state of siege that West Beirut suffered in 1982 is beautifully recorded in Mahmoud Darwish's Memory for Forgetfulness, which is the book that I have gone to again and again when I read about the hunger, the thirst, and the absolute devastation of the Israeli genocidal war in Gaza. So thank you for reminding us of that. And on the question of impunity, I think one of the things that we're going to talk about in a little bit is the fact that the press has been so incredibly complicit by such venal things, such as calling entire civilian areas Hezbollah strongholds, much the same as they have been doing in Gaza with saying Hamas strongholds. And that kind of a claim of attacking a political grouping is used, and the press completely and totally goes along with it and justifies it. So it is really important to note the extent to which that impunity is generated, not just by the politicians in the United States and Europe, but also by an incredibly supine press. On that note, we'll move to Maya, who's going to talk about the crises that were in place before October 2023, and the way that those crises have played out since in Lebanon. Maya, please.
Yes, hi. I just want to extend my thanks, and it's good to be with everybody, especially at these times. Being together is always helpful. So what I'm gonna do is sort of set the scene in Lebanon for that, kind of focusing on the last 5 years. And when we were putting together the primer, you know, we were thinking, I mean, what does it mean to even begin 5 years ago? Or what does it mean to begin in 2019? You could have begun at different points. But certainly, you know, since 2006, maybe even previous to that, 2005, there have been a series of crises and then kind of normalization of those crises. But since 2019, there's been kind of an accelerationist mode where you cannot normalize anymore. It's sort of like Jenga, like you keep taking out pieces, and once you take two, you reach a critical moment. And I think that the danger is that, you know, this war might be the last piece that brings everything down. Now, I always think that to understand Lebanon, to analyze things happening in Lebanon, you have to keep 3 scales in mind: the national, the regional, and the international. And at each of those scales, there are sort of shifting parameters of agency and sometimes contradiction, agreement, disagreement, and contradiction. And within that, you have to split, you know, politics, society, economy. But in a lot of conversations about Lebanon, the scale of the national often gets less attention, although you can't really understand, I think, the stakes of what's happening today without putting it in the scene of these, the national context. So we'll be starting here. I'm going to start October 2019. We're going to go through the Syrian war and the refugee, how that refracts in Lebanon, the 2019 uprising, an economic collapse, a port explosion, and a hollowed out state. So the Syrian uprising and subsequent civil war opened a new chapter for Lebanon. Hezbollah sent fighters to intervene militarily on the side of Bashar al-Assad's regime in 2012. And this decision really sent ripples in the organization itself, among its leadership, its supporters, and its detractors. Since then, I would say Hezbollah has occupied this very interesting position at being at once the most popular and the most unpopular political party. It's like a very interesting position to occupy. It receives the most votes in parliamentary elections and the most cross-sectarian votes, and it is also the basis around which opposition forms. It's, you know, currently it's not in the majority camp in parliament. And it's possible, you know, that in hindsight, this entry into Syria will be seen as a very significant factor for where we are now, including how it made the party vulnerable to certain kinds of intelligence and infiltrations. Before the Syrian war, hundreds of thousands of Syrians, mostly men, lived and worked in Lebanon as semi-skilled and unskilled laborers, mostly in construction and agricultural industries. The war in Lebanon and Syria led to the influx of about 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Approximately 1 million are officially registered with the UNHCR, and then the Lebanese state decided to stop counting basically in 2006. And perhaps there's an additional 1 million unofficially living in the country at its highest point. And this effectively grew the complete resident population of Lebanon by 30%. And this rapid change really did put strain on already meager services provided by the state and has led to rising violence, anger, and bigotry against Syrian refugees. To date, about a third of Lebanon is not Lebanese. So Lebanese society is highly diverse, highly complex, and about a third of everyone who lives in Lebanon are actually from other Arab countries, refugees from other Arab countries who have experienced war and ethnic cleansing: Sudan, Iraq, Palestinians, and Syrians. But, Lebanon is also home to more than 100,000 migrant domestic workers, mostly women. In 2019, the Lebanese central bank's financial engineering scheme collapsed. By that summer, the black market rate between the pound and the dollar was 15,000 to 1, while the official pegged rate was 1,500 liras to $1. By early fall, the government began to implement planned austerity measures. But on October 17, in October, about 100 wildfires broke out throughout the country. And right now, actually, there are wildfires across the country that are not being put out, causing residents to flee their home, and the Lebanese government had really failed to maintain any firefighting equipment. And this really spurred a crisis, and alongside which, about a week later, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese took to the streets, declaring a revolution against political sectarianism and corruption. The immediate triggers were a new monthly WhatsApp text. I think we all know how critical WhatsApp is these days. And, this moment had really been building for at least a decade. And 2019 was more the cresting of a wave as sort of its beginning. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, went on strikes, blocked roads, and effectively paralyzed the country. The protests were regional, cross-sectarian, multi-generational, and it was brutally suppressed by Lebanese security forces and sort of also internal polarization, and then the COVID-19 pandemic kind of ground it to a halt. Amidst this background, in 2020, there was the port explosion on August 4th, 2020, where about 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a warehouse at the Beirut port exploded, killing 219 people and injuring thousands. Hundreds of thousands also were displaced. The destruction of the grain silos led to bread shortages and hunger. In face of this catastrophe, government authorities again failed to take any effective action. Judicial investigations into the cause of the explosion and the responsibility for the explosion were blocked by many different powerful politicians, including Hezbollah, in order to block investigation to hide their different and overlapping responsibilities for the disaster. Everything ranging from like criminal neglect to things like corruption and just the lack of services at the port, what the state of the port was. To date, nobody has been held accountable. Now, in the wake of the revolution, the port explosion, and the COVID-19 epidemic, Lebanon's financial crises accelerated rapidly, exacerbated by corruption in the banking sector. Banks illegally cut off people from their checking accounts, from their bank accounts, and the pound devalued by 98%. The World Bank in 2021 warned that Lebanon's economic collapse risked being one of the worst in modern history, the 3 worst in modern history. Different subsidies were cut off, and at some point, the country experienced total blackouts. Widespread shortages of basic necessities, including food and medicine, skyrocketing inflation led to about today, the UN estimates that about 80% of Lebanon is living in complex poverty. About 200,000 Lebanese left Lebanon. One was like another wave of migration during this period. And the 2 largest industries with flight, and this has a big impact today, are the health industry and the education industry. Now, facing this kind of inflation of over 200% and massive unemployment, most people in Lebanon are struggling to survive. And this is the context of 1.2 million people being displaced today, and the targeting of a healthcare system that is already sort of hanging on by a thread amidst all these crises. And I think this is extremely significant. There has been political paralysis at the level of the state for the past few years. So there hasn't been, there's a vacuum at the presidential level, a vacuum at the governmental level. We have a caretaker government. And what this means is also that anything that required a presidential signature for the last 2 years hasn't been done in Lebanon, from judicial appointments to, or they've been done under extraordinary measures. So meanwhile, amidst all of this and amidst this terrible invasion, the death toll has been rising. Lebanese health authorities, as of today, have said that 47 attacks on medical facilities have occurred since October 8th, 2023. 95 health workers have been killed and 77 injured while on duty. More than 2,574 Lebanese or people in Lebanon of different nationalities have been killed. More than 12,000 have been injured. The country's healthcare system is fraying. 6 hospitals are no longer operational, 4 are only partially functioning, and 13 hospitals and primary care centers are closed in the areas of the south. So, yeah, I'll end here. This is sort of brings us to this moment.
Thank you, Maya. And I think that that is quite a significant statistic about the extent to which the healthcare system in Lebanon has brought down to its knees, because it's also what we're saying as part of Israel's genocidal policy in Gaza has been the destruction of the healthcare system, which is, of course, absolutely necessary for the survival of the public there. The other thing I think that is worth mentioning is the extent to which the indiscriminate pager and walkie-talkie attacks that Lara talked about resulted in massive disabilities. People were blinded, people lost hands or had to have limbs amputated, which of course also has resonances with the far larger scale of destruction in Gaza, where huge numbers of children are amputees. I recently wrote an email to Jasbir Puar to tell her how much I thought that the right to maim seemed to be a diagnosis of today's devastations, and she wrote back to say that she hated the fact that it had become so incredibly resonant again. Okay, what we're going to do at this stage is I'm going to put one question each to one of our speakers, and then we're going to switch into a conversational mode where we're going to talk about everything else that's going on, and then we're going to switch over to Q&A. The question that I've got for you, Lara, is the role of Hezbollah, the relationship of Hezbollah to the Lebanese society, and particularly in the Dahia. If you could speak to that, that'd be really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Laleh. And you know, I'm going to start with Hezbollah, and then I'll turn to Dahia. So as I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah was founded in the mid-'80s as a resistance force fighting the Israeli troops who had at that point invaded Lebanon multiple times and continued to occupy the south part of Lebanon. And this was also during the Lebanese Civil War, right? And most of the militias that had fought in that civil war were political parties before the war, And then in 1990, when the war ended, they all went back to being political parties. Well, Hezbollah had emerged during the civil war. So when it ended, they made the decision to become a political party like the other parties in Lebanon. So since 1992, and Maya just mentioned this as well, Hezbollah has participated in elections, both municipal and parliamentary, and has done quite well, and has held cabinet positions since 2005. And as it grew as a political party, it also, became imbricated in all the kinds of political machinations that every Lebanese political party does, right? They get on electoral lists with people from other parties, and those alliances shift and change with different moments, and so they're basically functioning as a Lebanese political party since '92. And it's worth noting that that change happened under the leadership of the recently assassinated leader Nasrallah, who took that position also in 1992. Since the early 90s, Hezbollah has also built a massive social welfare network. And again, they're not the only group in Lebanon to do this, but they're probably the most institutionalized and organized at this point. And that welfare network is important because it fills the complete absence of any such network from the Lebanese state. So here, Hezbollah really functions as an umbrella organization under which you have many different kinds of institutions. You have welfare organizations, orphanages, hospitals, low-cost clinics, many of which have been attacked or destroyed or closed in the current Israeli violence on Lebanon. You also have schools. There's an organization or NGO of engineers and construction workers that has done a lot of the rebuilding of Lebanon. There's an institution for the disabled. And many, many people work for these organizations or draw on their services in different capacities, right? So for example, this past Sunday, when Israeli airstrikes began targeting branches of Al-Qard al-Hassan, which is a non-interest financial institution, you can sort of think of it as an Islamic bank, it gives out a lot of microloans in the country. It's an institution that's affiliated with the party, but it's a civilian institution, right? Some 300,000 Lebanese civilians rely on the microcredit loans provided by that financial institution. It's literally the largest microlender in the country. So that's an example of the ways in which Hezbollah is actually part of a broader Lebanese society. Then we can also talk more about the pager attacks, right, that have come up several times. The Israeli army would have people believe that they targeted Hezbollah in those attacks, but we have to ask what that even means, because, they could say, well, we got a Hezbollah member. That could mean a bureaucrat, a janitor, a doctor, a teacher, anyone who voted for the party in an election, somebody who lives in a household with somebody who might support the party some of the time. It's a meaningless phrase and concept. Plus, we know that those pagers were also used by people not associated with the party. And of course, as you just pointed out, when they exploded, they injured everyone around them indiscriminately. So this kind of brings me to Dahya, which, again, it's a word in Arabic that just means suburb. And then over time, it became the way that people in Lebanon referred to the southern suburbs of Beirut. And Mona Harab has actually written, several decades ago, wrote a piece about how that word came to stand for the southern suburbs. Unless you, of course, work for legacy media in the United States, in which case you refer to that part of the city as the Hezbollah stronghold, right? It's also, I'm going to also mention here the time loop once again, and Tsolin brought this up as well, that we're all in, because most of what I've been saying and I'm about to say, I said in fora just like this one in 2006. And I was recently listening to a podcast that Mona Harab, who's done extensive research on Dahya, did recently. And she also commented on the same, I said these exact same things in 2006. So I think we have to also keep coming back to the ways that everything we're talking about is a part of a broader pattern of violence, right? And of Israeli violence in the region and colonial violence in the region. Okay, so back to Dahya. Dahya it's not just one administrative area, it's 4 municipalities plus parts of 3 others, plus informal settlements, plus refugee camps. And each of those municipalities has its own internal politics and different kinds of relationships to Hezbollah. They're run very differently depending on who the politicians are seated there at the time. It includes some of the most densely populated neighborhoods in Lebanon. It also includes places where you have, single family homes with gardens. It includes different types of, neighborhoods with really expensive apartment buildings, neighborhoods of very densely populated, rapidly constructed, more affordable and far less solid apartment buildings, right? You have informal settlements, you have spacious areas. It's not one kind of urban space. It also is far more diverse than people imagine. The population's probably about 75% Shia Muslim today. because it grew into the suburb both through urbanization in the 1960s, but also as a result of massive population displacements during the Civil War. So if we take Hatrek as an example, Hatrek, which is one of the Hezbollah stronghold neighborhoods the press likes to refer to, it used to be primarily Maronite. And that population was displaced during the Civil War and never returned. And many of the Shia Muslims who moved into that neighborhood were themselves displaced from the eastern suburbs of Beirut during the Civil War and never returned there. And then since the Civil War ended, since 1990, there have been Maronite mayors of Hatrek who run on lists with Hezbollah. And that municipality restored the Maronite church there. And in the 2000s, mass was being held regularly in that church. Dahiya's residents today also include many precarious populations, and the way that Maya was talking about the diversity of Lebanon's population today, many migrant workers and refugees live in parts of Dahiya because those are the neighborhoods that have housing that is affordable compared to the rest of Beirut. So it's a far more diverse in population area than people imagine as well. And then also just to take the example of Hatrek again, and I keep using that neighborhood partially because I know it, but also because it was completely destroyed during the 2006 war and has come under extraordinarily heavy attack this time as well. You're talking about apartment buildings containing, when I say thousands of residences, over 300,000 apartments. And they often have businesses on the ground floor, right? So shops and salons and vegetable stands and cafes with lattes and hookahs and fruit cocktails. So really the point here is that Dahiya is a lively, diverse part of Greater Beirut. It's a neighborhood that people used to go shop in part because you could also find cheaper goods and furniture. It's linked to the city. It's not this sort of cordoned off space. And when Israeli airstrikes are destroying Dahiya, just like when they're destroying other parts of Lebanon, just like when they're destroying Gaza, they're killing civilians, but they're also destroying the material context of people's lives, right? And people's memories and histories, whether those memories and histories are generations old or centuries old. And so all of that, I think, is what we need to be talking about.
I think that's really, really important what you said about some of these institutions being used by others, because I know as a matter of fact that the Palestinian refugees, the Syrian refugees, and some of the migrant workers who actually also live in the southern suburbs use those health care facilities in part because there is no other healthcare facility to use, and in part because Hezbollah makes those available or the Hezbollah civilian institutions make those available to the other populations. So I think it is really important when they bomb Gharda Hassan, it's going to be lots of different people that are affected by that, and not just a constituency of Hezbollah, which would be, for example, the Shia population. So I think I'm really glad you mentioned that. Tsolin, I'd like to actually ask you a question about the US and Europe's complicity, not only complicity, but actually sponsoring this being a part of their policy of what is happening in Lebanon, particularly because right now the sort of the genocide supporting foreign minister of Germany, Baerbock, is in, or was, I don't know if she still is, visiting Lebanon. To what extent is it, I mean, how do the US and the European states, for example, can speak of peace, aid, development, et cetera, with the war, and yet they are essentially feeding the Israeli war machine against Lebanon in this particular way? Can you say something about this kind of a contradiction that is happening?
Yeah, sure. I don't think it's much of a contradiction. I think that it's U.S. interests, right? So for U.S. interests, if it's forwarding U.S. interests, it's not necessarily a contradiction. This idea of aid and development and money influx, and then supporting or being involved actually in the war in Lebanon and the genocide in Gaza. So I don't see it as oppositionary, but I don't think. I think that's also something to remember with, that's how actually people like the German foreign minister and, the candidates for, like the vice presidential candidate for president in the US can say that, right? Like the first thing is like, Israel has the right to defend itself, and then say like, I'm really concerned about these civilian lives. So I think maybe for for me, that doesn't sound like that would square, like how do you square that circle? But I think if you're looking at it from the specific viewpoint of US interests, it's completely in line, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Maya, actually, Nadya, I want to step back a little bit to the French Mandate period and ask you something about what aspects of the French mandatory colonial rule do you still see continuing in the post-Mandate area, and how does that shape the current crisis, like the sort of the devastation of Lebanon right now, if you will?
Oh, forgot to unmute. Thank you, Laleh. I'll try to keep this really short, just in the interest of time. So there's a few elements I want to highlight. First of all, the role of the post-war League of Nations mandatory system was ostensibly to have the allegedly more developed Western empires of France and Great Britain take these newly formed Arab states of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine by the hand as it leads them towards the path of that paragon of development, which is statehood. And then only after the Western countries deem them developed enough to run their own affairs would they then grant them independence. But history shows us, right, back then and even till today, that despite this mandate, France and Great Britain did everything possible, if not to prevent viable statehood, then to actually ensure that whatever resulting states would be consistently hamstrung by a number of things, including internal divisions and continued reliance on their external French and British sponsors. And they did this across the board, right, across the sort of board of mandates, right, through exploiting, in some cases, already existing tensions between different religious groups or economic groups, and in other cases, creating and deepening new ones. So the French mandate's focus in Lebanon was providing resources for the two key groups that it wished, as Tsolin mentioned earlier, to create as a kind of new elite that would class with shared interests, right, with a stake, in other words, in the continued French presence, even after the mandate ends. And excluded to a large degree, right, the Shia primarily centered, but not exclusively, but primarily centered in the southern part of the country. And we see that this neglect has continued through the early decades of the Republic, and as my colleagues have discussed amply here and also in the primer, right, continues to be the scenario that was both contributing to the situation today, but also has been exploited. The French mandate also set up an education system such that they divided it between private schools run by either individuals or missionary organizations that could set their own curricula, could teach whatever history they wanted, and a public school system that was directly administered by the mandate. And the public schools were far outnumbered by the private schools. The public schools were geared towards the lower classes, whom the French articulated clearly as what they believed was mostly Muslim, right? And the private schools were geared towards the elite classes that were aimed at funneling them into higher education. So the education system that the French mandate set up was designed to deepen the ways in which they had already sort of to augment the system that they were already setting up, whereby certain sects are able to access different types of education that would then continue to deepen and cement sort of class sectarian divisions, right? And this we also see kind of the situation going to the present. I would also just refer back to Tsolin's earlier introductory comments on the historical ties, particularly that go back to the Mandate era between the Maronites, particularly the Gemayel family and the Zionists in Palestine. This would form a foundation for a long-lasting relationship from the 30s all the way through to, in fact, the present, but would manifest in particular ways, especially in 1982. As Maya has written about elsewhere, right, it's ironic perhaps that both Lebanon and Israel rely on religious and sectarian demographics to maintain the edifice of their state. And the last point I'll just bring up quickly is, relatedly, the demographic concerns with maintaining Lebanon as a Christian majority entity that was behind the engineering of the 1932 census would also be one of the reasons why most Palestinian refugees in Lebanon after the Nakba remain without citizenship or any civil rights, right? Very, very limited until the present. And only about 30,000 Palestinian Christians were granted citizenship between the years of about 1949 and 1951, again, in order to maintain Lebanon's Christian demographic majority, at least on paper.
Divide and rule has always been an imperial policy in wherever it was that the empire put its claws. Maya, a question for you. Because you talked about these incredible crises that the Lebanese were dealing with up into the run-up of the 7th of October, can you also say something about how those the intensification of those crises after the Israeli state began to attack and bomb Lebanon since October have created unities, changes in position, new ways of getting together, new ways of organizing within the Lebanese polity, please?
Sure. I think, part of why it's important to link these different scales together is because when you do pay attention, when you do sort of begin at the national scale, it's impossible to make the argument that Hezbollah is a foreign agent. It's impossible, right? So, and that is the prevailing argument that we are seeing now. Or at least that's how it's being framed in a lot of the even this discourse about saving Lebanon, right? Or fighting on behalf actually of the majority of Lebanese. And the way that even when we talk about crises and how they manifest today, the reason why Qard al-Hassan has expanded so rapidly is because it was one of the few places you could get dollars from during the economic crisis, right? So many people used it. That's kind of how we have to think about these. In terms of the, and Nadya sort of addressed this a little bit here. I think that the stress, like any social system, has seams, right? Has seams, and when you put pressure, those seams are actually where they might burst, right? Or where they might continue to stretch. And that is exactly kind of the social, when you think about the internal, is this war, is this invasion causing new sort of configurations, social configurations, social political configurations? First thing I would say is nobody likes to be invaded. This should be a basic fact. I don't know why people think that when it comes to Lebanon, this becomes controversial. No, some people like being invaded. No, nobody likes being invaded. Nobody likes being occupied. And I think that the calculation, and I don't know anymore if it's a calculation or if it's an excuse that the Israeli army is making in targeting civilian areas, particularly that are hosting a lot of displaced Lebanese. In some way, there are miscalculations along the way. So, for example, when you do an assassination bombing in Kola, Tariq Jadidi, that actually brings up the importance that is not something that's happening in the moment for a lot of residents in that area. That moment is the moment of 1982. That moment is the moment. All these histories are animated. So I think there are miscalculations happening, and I think the people in Lebanon are far more on the same page than the political leadership in Lebanon. Again, that's not a coincidence given the historical trajectories that we've charted. And it's not a coincidence because it's almost like a advertising campaign happening if you watch Lebanese television. Advertising campaign for who would like to inherit the spoils of this war while we're in the middle of it. So I think we're getting to a point where there's an impasse between the sort of people's impulses, political leadership's impulses. And partly that is because one of the strategies that the Israeli state is using is to say, give up Hezbollah or have a civil war. Right? And sort of a lot of the sort of historical national consensus post-civil war was never again. That was going to be really one of the lines. Like, this is something that we don't want again. Another civil war. So it's a very disgusting tactic, I would say, to say, give up part of your population, accept that a third of your people are legitimate targets, or go into a civil war. It's not going to work. I don't think it will work on the national level, but I do think that there's increasing cracks in the seams of the political configuration of Lebanon.
I think it's a very important point you make about the civil war element, because actually looking across the entirety of the Middle East, at least since the beginning of this century, what we see is this kind of a generation of civil wars that are actually been really put forward by external, really pushed forward by external powers, facilitated by external powers, which has been enormously significant in actually causing devastation and de-development from the borders of Iran Lebanon all the way through to North Africa. I'd like us now to sort of join in a conversation together, and I'm going to start by one of the questions that Ani Tonoyan in the Q&A has asked, which I think starts with Tsolin's presentation. And Ani asks, has Israel's view towards Middle Eastern Christians drastically changed from positive to negative? For example, why is there a targeting of the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem and Christians in Palestine if Israel is openly associated with Lebanese Maronites? Would Tsolin, you or one of the other colleagues like to take this?
Maybe I'll start, if that's okay with everyone. So thanks for your question. I think that what's consistent here is the desire for Israeli hegemony, right? And the attempt to not isolate Israel as a state. So I think that the Israeli state worked with Maronite Christians, right, with the leadership of the Maronite Christians over time, not necessarily because they were interested in anything having to do with Christianity per se, at all, but rather it was to serve their own interests, right? So they wanted to bring a Christian state into the neighborhood and to strengthen the idea of a Christian state because they were also a Jewish state in that neighborhood, right? Just as an example. And the idea that having a Christian state, like Ben-Gurion talked about it to the Prime Minister Moshe Sharet in the 1950s, he was trying to encourage more and more intervention because the idea of a Christian state would help Israel out of isolation. So this was a constant sort of existential issue that Ben-Gurion had, right? Now, then there's someone like Ariel Sharon. So when he was defense minister under Menachem Begin, did not share this idea of Christian state. Maybe this is our moral duty, right? That's what Begin believed. He really looked at them as being an instrument, right, of Israeli hegemony. So I think that that's the consistency there is that the use of a community, and it happened in this case to be the Maronites in Lebanon for different historical reasons. And in Armenian, with the Armenian case that you mentioned, they have to do with land, right? So they have an entire quarter, a historical quarter, the Armenian quarter, and there is tension there because they want to annex this area more and more, right? So it's not necessarily about looking at Christians differently. And actually, let me just quickly say this. It's also interesting to note, like there was a conversation over time within the members of the Israeli state to see like maybe they needed a different type of partner in Lebanon, right? So there was a conversation of maybe looking at Emel actually at one point as a possible, partner. Right? Or there was a possibility of just moving away from someone like Bashir Gemayel and working with someone like Saad Haddad, who later on becomes the leader of the Southern Lebanese army, right? So it's just a matter of who forwards their position. And that's nothing to say, let me just say this really quickly, that's nothing to say about, what were the positions of these people. I haven't had a chance to talk about that. We don't need to, but the positions of that Bashir Gemayel had are different than Amin Gemayel. But the Israeli state, actually, and the Israeli government consistently thought that they were one and the same. And they thought of Christianity as one thing, and that Maronites equaled Christians, et cetera. And that's also not the case. And that was shown to them time and time again, sort of this, the repetitive thing that Maya actually mentioned, that the people are not the same page as the political leadership. Right. But actually, the Israeli state keeps on thinking it is. And they keep on repeating that same mistake over and over again. Sorry, I'll stop there.
But I think you're also right that the calculations in Lebanon and Palestine are different. The calculations in Lebanon are about finding some sort of a local puppet or ally or whatever you want to call it, whereas in Palestine, it is precisely a zero-sum game over land.
Depending on, though, I would argue that has changed a little bit now. Right? Yes. Because I think that now that might not necessarily be the case. But yes, absolutely. Historically, for sure.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to say anything going on that, Maya?
I just would jump in also that one of the connections here is between Lebanon and Palestine in today and in the recent past, is that also Israel doesn't want any armed resistance to its colonial project, right? So that's also one of its goals, not only in Lebanon, but in actually all of the across all of its borders. And more generally in the region. That is one of the interests also that is at play now.
Thank you.
And I'm going to add one last thing, which is also, I think we have to, I'm thinking about the way the question was asked. And thank you for this question, Ani. Another way we can think about how it hasn't had anything to do with actually Christianity or Christians is to look at the history of colonization, Israeli colonization in Palestine, where, you know, Christian villages were also depopulated. You know, Palestinian Christians experienced the Nakba, were displaced, were massacred. And then even, you know, throughout that history, you mentioned the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem. There's also a really a long history with the Coptic Church in Jerusalem, for example, and an Israeli state repression of attempts to take the land, of attempts to control the Coptic Church. And that, for example, that relationship has shifted over time depending on the position of Israel and Egypt, right? And the position of the Coptic Church in Egypt towards things like the politics. So it's both that Palestinian Christians have been colonized as well, and it's that the church dioceses in Palestine have had shifting positions depending on the political relationships of those churches to the Israeli state at different moments in time.
As an Iranian, I also want to add that Ben Gurion had a neighborhood policy, and that was to actually establish a relationship with non-Arabs. So Iran and Turkey, for example, were quite significant possible potential allies for the state of Israel. And of course, until the fall of the Shah in the revolution, Iran was cultivated and had very close relationships with Israel. Turkey still has a relationship with Israel. And so it's, in a way, there's a lot of different levels at which the Israeli state has tried to cultivate relationships with either subnational groupings or with supranational groupings. And I think that relationship with Christians across different borders is also affected by that. Does anybody else want to say anything else to this question before we move on to the next one? Maya.
I want to intervene again, just to say, like, we can't forget that also when these borders were formed and the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the sort of beginning of a Euro-imperial project through the mandate system also ruptured religious forms of transnationalism that were extremely meaningful and practiced, right? Like transnational archdioceses, different, and then, you know, following 48, I mean, there used to be in Lebanon, like, for example, between Lebanon and Palestine, there's just religious traffic, Easter, baptisms. I mean, we can't forget that also, right? That these religious worlds inherently were transnational legally. First of all, there's a legal structure that makes them transnational, and borders really impose themselves also on these forms of relation that were refracted to religion. And not just, I mean, usually I think, sadly, when people say religion in the Middle East, they just think Islam, but particularly actually for Christian communities in the Levant.
Thank you. The next question is from Mina Zaman, who says, what explanation does Israel provide for their violence before Hamas existed, like during the Nakba? So we know that they justify their destruction because of October 7th and trying to eradicate Hamas now, but what about the time before that? Does anybody want to take that?
I can start, and then my comrades can chime in. I think one way to think about this is to remind ourselves that Israel was created as the outcome of a European colonial movement. And so, and when the Zionist movement was organizing in Europe, in response to European anti-Semitism, right, they were drawing on European colonial ideas. And those ideas were quite explicit about any people existing on the land that was to be colonized being a problem, right? That was not, it was not a European colonialism was not a bad thing in Europe when the Zionist movement was coming about. And so they drove explicitly on these kinds of ideas. So when I think one of the ways to understand this is that it's part of a kind of colonial violence. And when we keep saying colonial violence, we're talking about the idea that if you want to take this land, you need to the people on that land either need to leave or need to be removed or need to acquiesce to being ruled by the colonial entity. And those are essentially the only three options. And when you come into a context with that kind of a colonial mindset, I don't even know that the justification, like that's the justification, right? I don't know that they had to provide like a defensive justification initially, because the justification was we are creating this as like we're colonizing this land, as our new homeland, and therefore we need to create it. And to create it, we need to clear it or obtain the consent of the population that lives there by force.
Nadya, and then Maya.
I mean, I would just add here that they may not, the Israeli forces may not have used the word terrorist as often as we hear it, particularly in the wake of the global war on terror discourse, but they certainly substituted other words. And I would just remind us of the fact that in 1956, right, going back to Gaza, right, Israel sort of completely demolished huge. I mean, it's almost, if you change the dates, it's almost exactly right, as we've mentioned, the same playbook that we've seen happening over the last year in Gaza for sure, and also as we're seeing increasingly in Lebanon, where they, and again, it's not even that history is repeating itself in the sense that they at the time also attacked and demolished a Shifa hospital, right? And the argument, quote unquote, that was made for why they did this was they need to root out the sort of guerrilla, as they called it, right? The guerrilla groupings that were attacking the existence of the state of Israel. So it's, it's pretty much the same consistent one. It's not like it's changed, that the tactics have remained the same and the argumentation has remained the same, even if the vocabulary has changed. And I would refer everyone to a wonderful article by Asmat al-Halabi on this particular moment.
Thanks, Nadya. Maya, did you want to say something before I move back to Lara?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some to like basically I think part of our conversation today and that is happening all around us is about when do you start to tell the story? When do you start to tell history? And that's a power move, right? Like who gets to define the beginning of the event? And that's partly, I think, a colonial framework of time and of temporality, basically. Like time begins with the colonial project, history begins with the colonial project. And not only that, but then you get to choose any sort of segregated event within that history and start telling it from that point. And something that's always frustrated me personally is when we talk about the Lebanese border, and the joining, like the sort of opening of the front on May 8th, people act as if that's an isolated incident, but anyone who had been paying attention to that border for the last year previous to May 8th, it has been heating up. Israel did take over half of a divided town called Rajar. They built an edifice around it. When Hezbollah started bombing on May 8th, they were bombing an occupied territory of Lebanon. So those things are important also when we even talk about this border in this current moment. These are very long-standing, and you cannot actually begin on May 8th. Beginning on May 8th really brings into this argument of like, oh, this surprise attack. No, there's no surprises. This border has been heating up for years now. And there have been daily violations of Lebanese sovereignty, air, land, sea, and also physical sort of altercations in terms of this. And I really urge people to think very carefully about when we start to tell the story, when we start to tell any story.
Thanks, Maya. Did you, Lara?
And I really, I just wanted to add one quick thing that, but what both Nadya and Maya said made me think of, which is I think part of it too, and just like the idea that Israel is providing these kinds of consistent explanations for their responses, I think brings me back to what the thing I was saying earlier about impunity, and also about expectation. Like, why would you expect someone not to respond if you are taking their land or bombing their sovereign territory or crossing into their airspace? And then why, like, I think we need to flip the question around. And why would we expect a group or a country or a people not to respond? It's this idea that you're just supposed to be like, okay, yes, I will be a colonial subject. Why? Where does that expectation come from? And I think that's what we need to be asking.
Thanks. I think that is absolutely spot on. The next question is from Uri Veit, who asks Maya, says, Professor Mikdashi referred to Hezbollah as simultaneously the most and least popular political organization in Lebanon. Can you elaborate on what public opinion of Hezbollah is in Lebanon among different communities? And this question is both for Maya and anybody else who would like to answer.
Thanks for this question, and please help me out. I just wanted to add before to Lara's last point, I think this impunity comes and extends from the impunity of the United States, the impunity of American empire in the region. That's where it actually comes from, and that's what it's backed up from. I mean, it's very similar, right? When you see an American president say, oh, we have to defend ourselves in Syria. Like, how does that make any sense, right? Other than the logic of empire, which is a logic of impunity. And that's sort of how to understand this. Like, well, why aren't you a happy colonial subject? Haven't you gotten the message yet? So when it comes to Hezbollah and why I said it was both the most popular and the most unpopular, partly that's because of like any sort of political organization, it speaks to multiple communities. And it's also part of what Lara was saying, it's very extended, like what Hezbollah is. Hezbollah is a political party. Hezbollah also has a military wing. Hezbollah has a massive social services wing. And when I talk about political representation, I'm not only talking about the higher levels like parliament. I also mean lower levels, municipalities, and so forth. But I think most of the popularity that Hezbollah actually enjoys, and the popularity that remains, is in its resistance to Israeli occupation and invasion, and its resistance to the colonial project in Palestine, which actually is these are very popular positions across sects, I would say across generations, and to some extent across sects also. Like classes. I was gonna say, yeah. To some extent. Why it's unpopular is because, like any political party, particularly in a system that is corrupting, a political system that is corrupting and corrosive, like the Lebanese political system and the political leadership in general, it's not immune to making the mistakes that other political parties have made. Whether that means trying to stop forestalling, playing into sort of corrupt networks of corruption, aligning themselves with deeply unpopular and polarizing people, or playing sort of political games that frustrate, such as over the presidency or over, which are within their rights, but which are they're in their rights as a political party within a democratic system, but are also extremely unpopular. And finally, we shouldn't forget that also, Hezbollah was, so it's both very popular and unpopular. And the confusing part actually is that it's unpopular sometimes for the same reasons of why it's popular. Right, so it's unpopular because of this idea of like, oh, without you, we would be in peace, right? We wouldn't have this problem at all. You know, what is Lebanon's problem other than Hezbollah? Which is the exact reverse of the argument of actually, this is the party that is defending our land and is defending our people broadly configured, and that expresses our refusal of a colonial project in Palestine.
Thank you. Nadya, please.
I think that
Actually,
was me.
Lara, go
Yeah.
ahead. I can
Yeah.
follow you. Go
Okay.
ahead, Lara.
Maya, thank you. That covered most of it. I was just going to add, I think it's also important to keep in mind that just like with any other political party, popularity shifts and rises and wanes. And if we were to look at the course of Hezbollah's participation in the Lebanese political system from 1992 to the present, there are moments at which its popularity skyrocketed across multiple communities. I would say not universal, but quite close to universal. Say around the late 90s and around 2000 after liberation. And then there are moments where it, sank. There's moments, so it's not a consistent popularity. When they entered the Syria civil war in 2012, for example, there was a dip in popularity because a lot of Lebanese were unhappy with that decision. Historically, moments of Israeli attack where Hezbollah has been leading the only resistance against those attacks on Lebanese sovereignty have led to rises in the party's popularity. But this does rise and wane.
Nadya, and then Tsolin.
I was just going to sort of add to what Maya and Lara had been saying, and just note that one of the things that we've been seeing over the last several weeks on kind of, in the public sphere, public discourse coming from within Lebanon is that people are openly acknowledging that even though they can be vigorously opposed to a number of positions that Hezbollah has taken, extremely problematic positions over the last several years, that they do also recognize that Hezbollah is pretty much the main deterrent keeping Israel from actually destroying and sort of fundamentally occupying Lebanon. So I think that tension is kind of what is being pointed out here as well. But it's happening publicly. So I think that's worth noting.
Tsolin.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I think also it's important to note, like historically, its allies in the government are quite diverse as well, right? So it entered an agreement in 2006 with Michel Aoun's party and the Armenian Dashnak party. So that also sort of demonstrates its range and also resistance, as Maya said. I just want to add, resistance can also be resistance to the ruling elite, that it also sort of seems to personify, at least with regards to that particular agreement and that time period.
Thank you. We've only got 2 minutes and there's still some questions. I am going to answer the 2 questions about Iran later, but I want to read Zaina Al-Attar's note because I think I have a response to that and I think you guys will too. Zaina says, I don't have a question, but as a Lebanese Canadian and a doctoral student in anthropology, I wanted to express my deep gratitude to all the speakers. I do too. I'm truly appreciative of their candor. Over the past year, I have found myself slowly losing faith in academia. So have I. I think a lot of us have, especially due to the hypocrisy and silence surrounding many critical issues, such as what is happening in Palestine and in Lebanon. And I wanted to say something to this, and I wanted to end on this note because it is a note of thanks to you guys for being so amazing. But I also wanted to counsel, despite the incredible mourning and despite the grief that we're all feeling, to counsel against despair, because I think it is really important for us to find some way to organize, some way to push back against this. Here in the UK, you guys have encampments in North America. Here in the UK, we've had union organizations. There have been people engaged in direct action. There are people that are trying to do political education. And I think that any little thing that we do is in some ways a small step towards a longer term possibility of solidarity with the people in Palestine and Lebanon. I know that in the short term, it looks devastating, and it is devastating as a genocide goes on. And as Lara mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people have already been killed, whether directly or through lack of access to food and medical care. But I think it is really important to find some way, some area, some sliver of hope somewhere and organize, because that is really the only way to go. Does anybody else want to come in on that before we say goodbye to everyone?
That's beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you, Laleh.
Thank you, Laleh.
My
it was
pleasure.
good to be in a conversation with all of you at
Yeah,
this moment.
thank you to all.
Likewise.
Thank you all, comrades, and thank you again to the IMS, or Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington, and especially to Mona and Christian for organizing this. Thank you for being there. And the questions that have not been answered, I am going to type in a response, or one of us is going to type in a response, so you do get a response on there. Thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating, Laleh. Thank you so much. Thanks,
My pleasure.
everyone.
If I can just
Bye.
add,
Thanks,
I
Mona.
hope you'll join us for our future events. We have 2 upcoming events, just briefly. One on November 1st, Smugglers in States Negotiating the Maghreb at its Margins, with Max Galian and Diana Kim. And one on November 7th, Amulet Tales, Race, Magic, and Medicine in Egypt, with Taylor Moore and Nefertiti Takla. So thank you. I also want to just send my profound thanks to the panelists for taking the time to do this today. And it's really important work, and we're just so grateful for all of your knowledge and expertise. So thank you again for doing this. And that's all.